Hello, and welcome back to another episode of International Immersion, a podcast that seeks to capture the combined experiences of people, places, culture, traveling, current events, living abroad, and much, much more. For today's episode, I would like to cover something that the entire world has been transfixed on for the last 2 weeks, and that is the situation in Ukraine with the Russian incursion and humanitarian crisis that has been sparked because of that. So for today's episode, I want to kind of go over what has happened thus far, starting with a background on Ukraine, a little bit about its history, culture, people, and specifically the war in the Donbass and Luhansk areas of the country, stemming from 2014 and the annexation of Crimea in the same year as well, which in many cases started this, and the current situation in a nutshell is pretty much just a continuation of the ongoing conflict, as it never really did cease in the last 8 years. So to begin with, Ukrainian history goes back a long time, and both Ukrainians and Russians can date back a lot to Vladimir the Great of the Kievan Rus, around in the end of the 9th and 10th centuries, well over a thousand years ago. And in many cases, there's a lot of similarities, as both the president of Ukraine and of Russia both have the first name of Vladimir. If that's not something that's reminiscent, then I'm not sure what else is. But Ukraine has been independent off and on, but at the same time, it's been under the Russian yoke for quite a bit of its history. And it was one of the most prosperous parts of the old Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1991, it became independent, and I would say, and in many cases, because of what's happened, they have really developed a strong national identity, even though a large part of the eastern population of Ukraine still speaks Russian and still identifies with Russia in many capacities. But I would say with the current events and what's happening now, I think you're seeing almost an irreparable partition or severing of Ukrainians and Russians in many cases, because this conflict has not only divided states, but it's divided families. There are many people in Ukraine who have family in Russia and vice versa, which makes the whole situation even worse. But to kind of go in chronological order now, back in 2014, Russia seized Crimea, and in many cases, two rebellions against Ukrainian government control happened in Donetsk and the Luhansk areas of southeastern Ukraine, which sparked a conflict in both areas, which has lasted from 2014 till now. Now, officially, Russians were not involved, but unofficially, everyone knows that there was a lot of Russian influence, and there were Russian troops and other factors clearly tying this as being funded and supported, if not directly, indirectly, and in many cases, you would have to say directly by Russia. That has continued. It's caused a lot of casualties. It's displaced, thousands of people from both regions. And the irony is, many of those people now will have been displaced again because of this continuation. So you already have this situation geopolitically with, Russians trying to regain, in one sense, a lot of imperial prestige that they feel they have lost with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and specifically with their president, Vladimir Putin, trying to revive, if not the Soviet Empire, revive Russian imperial greatness back to, the time of the Tsars, or however you want to characterize that. That is one analysis or analogy that has been seen in terms of Putin's mindset, at least from an observer looking in. Now, this has gone on for 8 years, and then as of February 24th, 2022, you have this massive special military operation, as the Russians call it, which in many cases is just flat out an invasion, which was launched on the 24th. It's gone on for over 2 weeks now, and it's caused an immense amount of damage to both people, infrastructure, and, is not going to end anytime soon. Let's put it that way. So basically what happened was around 2 a.m. on the 24th of February, Russian forces crossed the border from both Russia and Belarus on a number of fronts. They advanced north of Kiev, Kiev, which is the capital, Kharkiv, which is the second largest city in the northeast of the country, and then you had Russian forces from the Crimea move into southern Ukraine, along with a number of other areas. These were the main areas of advance, and the Russian plan, at least from what is known now, was to move down to try to capture Kiev, Kharkiv, the areas around the Dnieper, like Kherson, Mariupol, Sumy, a lot of the large centers in the east, south, and north of the country. Well, let's just say the Russians, from intelligence and information that's been made public now, were expecting a very quick operation, not a lot of resistance, in order to achieve their goals of establishing a puppet government that was more loyal to Moscow, or that is what the line that has been stated as of now. Clearly that has not happened. They have encountered a huge amount of resistance in all areas. In the north, they've been bogged down. They've not captured any major cities now, except for the exception of Kherson recently. And they have been suffering quite heavy losses, and I would say that it's really showing a lot of flaws and lack of preparedness and adaptability on the side of the Russians. I don't want to say this too much at this point because it's still quite early. It's only been 2 weeks, and like I said, I have a feeling this invasion is not going to end anytime soon, as I feel it will continue on for quite some time, unfortunately, at least from what I understand of the situation and having studied the region and knowing what kind of leader Vladimir Putin is, and he's not going to withdraw. He's probably only going to double down further to achieve his goals. So basically, Kiev, Kharkiv, the Luhansk and Donetsk areas, the area in north of Crimea, Kherson, Mariupol, Mykolaiv, and then Odessa. These are all areas that are have either been attacked or are in the risk or have a risk of have been attacked, especially Odessa. Odessa at this point has not received any direct attacks that we know of, but it is at risk. Russian forces are advancing toward Kiev. They've been stopped out in the suburbs. They are slowly inching forward, but they're facing a huge amount of resistance, and unfortunately it's displacing a lot of people, and casualties are increasing as well. The Russians have also advanced around Kharkiv, but they've also been repulsed, and they're being held off by the Ukrainian army and local volunteers or local defense forces that have been mustered and put together. The city of Mariupol on the Sea of Azov has been surrounded by Russian forces now. It's being shelled and subjected to airstrikes. Just today, a maternity hospital was hit, which was atrocious on every level. And they are still holding out, but the question is how much longer. The one major city they have taken in north of Crimea in the Dnieper Basin, the city of Kherson, which people are resisting as well, and the Russians are now moving up toward Mykolaiv, which is a port city north of Kherson on the Black Sea and toward the end of the Dnieper River. The Russians, as we know now, have advanced and launched 2 assaults on the city. Both have been repulsed, but no further updates at this time have been released that I am aware of. And then lastly, the Odessa, which has not been threatened as of now. Huge preparations for the city's defense are being made right now. And eventually, I do think the fighting will reach the Odessa area because while the Ukrainians have put up a great fight, they're doing very well in slowing down the Russians and causing them a lot of problems. I do think the Russians will continue to gain ground, albeit at a heavy cost and very slowly, because what started off as, for the Russians' mindset, was to be a quick operation is quickly turning into a war of attrition. And in wars of attrition, it's the side that usually has more that will win, because basically both sides are grinding each other down, and it's all a matter about manpower, supplies, and the will to continue fighting. The one interesting thing is, I would say, is that when people thought about this, a lot of people thought Ukraine would not stand much of a chance against the Russian military, given it's considered the second most powerful military on earth after the United States. But what's really surprising is that the Ukrainians have put up a tremendous amount of resistance, and the figures they've released, while needing to be taken with a grain of salt, are quite staggering in what damage they've inflicted on the Russians. As of now, there's nearly a 40-kilometer convoy stretching north of Kiev toward the border with Belarus that has been log jammed now for many days with very little progress, which and for standard military thinking is almost suicidal, because you never want to have a column stuck on a road that long, because it's an easy target, and the Ukrainians have been hitting it from news and other sources that I have been able to ascertain. So there's that. And then in the east around Kharkiv, basically the two northern areas of advance around Kiev and Kharkiv, and Sumy, which is further north toward the Russian border, closer to the borders of Belarus and Russia. While the Russians are gaining ground, things have largely stalled as of now. The one area that the Russians have seen much more success has been in the south. They've advanced out of Crimea, and they've taken a lot of the area north of Crimea up to the Dnieper River, including Kherson, and they have linked that advance to the separatist-controlled areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. So they are seeing more success in the south, albeit still facing stiff resistance, and they have run into some roadblocks as they're moving northwest toward Mykolaiv, and then finally, I imagine, their goal of Odessa, as previously mentioned. So that's that. And the other thing is, a lot of people are asking why the Russians have had such a problem when, as mentioned, they have one of the best militaries in the world, second best, as specified. I think it comes down to a number of factors. One, they were not expecting the level of resistance they have faced. Two, I think operationally they have not integrated their forces in the best way, combining their different armed elements, land, air, sea, supply, and others. I mean, they still have great capacity, and you're starting to see more of that being used. But at the same time, their performance has been rather abysmal in a number of in terms of coordinating their forces. And I think the other factor would be President Putin himself. I think he was not expecting this, and I think that the situation he's got himself in now is has surprised him, and I think many Russians are rather, especially in his inner circle in the Kremlin, I have a feeling they're quite taken aback by the situation, but at the same time, I don't think it's changed any of their minds or their will to not continue. They're going to continue. It's going to only get bloodier and bloodier. At least that is my opinion based on the information that's being released now from different sources. And the other thing that's quite terrifying is that the Russian forces have captured the Chernobyl reactor north of Kiev, which was the site of the 1986 meltdown, which was the largest in history and nearly wiped out that part of Europe if it had not been contained. And then they've also taken one of the largest nuclear complexes at Zaporizhia, near Kherson along the Dnieper River. And footage is shown of Russian troops firing in the complex as they set a training facility on fire, and some of the reactors were hit, albeit not significantly, but it still makes one very uneasy when thinking about nuclear reactors and being fired at, along with many other factors that come with that, because that's not something you can do. So let's just say that puts a shiver down my spine, and I feel anyone who knows anything about nuclear power would share in that sentiment as well. So I would just say that I think with what's happened now, the invasion is going to continue. It's estimated that Russia has already deployed 92 to 95% of their operational forces that they've amassed around Ukraine. They have been committed, and they are, moving forward. But the thing is, I do think the Russians will continue to take ground. I think they will capture more cities. But the problem I foresee is that while the Russians have a lot of troops, trying to hold down a country as large as Ukraine, occupy it, is going to be nearly impossible with the 200,000-ish soldiers that they've amassed, because Ukraine is a country of 44 million people as of now. 200,000 troops can do a lot, but 200,000 cannot hold down a country that and suppress an insurgency or an armed resistance. So I do think the Russians will continue to see more success on the battlefield, although they are paying a very heavy price. I think estimates from the United States and other NATO countries have estimated the death toll on the Russians between 2,000 and 4,000, and the Ukrainians, from the last estimates I've seen, have lost as many as 11,000, although I'll take that with a grain of salt. And then they've also lost a huge amount of equipment. And going back to the performance, you've seen a lot of vehicles run out of gas, supplies have run short, you've seen Russian soldiers looting stores. So there's, in many cases, you're seeing a lot of tactical incompetence and strategic incompetence on the side of the Russians. But what terrifies me the most is what's going to happen to the civilian population and non-combatants, because, as mentioned, they've hit hospitals, there's been a lot of infrastructure destroyed, and the death toll keeps rising. I mean, the official death toll is around 500 now, but I'm sure that is much, much higher, along with the number of soldiers on both sides that have been killed, wounded, or who are missing. So this is just the beginning. That is for sure. We're only 2 weeks into this, and I have a feeling that if things continue, I think things eventually might calcify to a point, but it's just a matter of how far the Russians are willing to go to push this invasion and how much resistance the Ukrainians are gonna put up. Because right now the fighting is primarily in suburbs and in the countryside. Once the Russians move into Kharkiv, Kiev, and other large cities, it's going to turn into urban fighting, and urban fighting is by far the bloodiest. Just think of Stalingrad, back in World War II. That resulted in nearly a million casualties if you combine both the Wehrmacht and the Soviet armed forces. So that would be a worst case scenario, along with what might happen to the civilian populations of these cities. And just the human cost is what's truly saddening to me. And then the other question is, what does this conflict have in terms of expanding or drawing other entities in? Because we have not seen a situation like this since World War II, and it's also turning into the largest refugee crisis since World War II, which is sobering on so many levels. So I would say for the long-term impact, we can't really say what's going to happen at this point because it's still too early to tell. There's too much in motion, but what is guaranteed is there's going to be a lot more death, a lot more destruction, and a lot more instability in Eastern Europe from this. And in many cases, I do think over the long term, this is going to be a strategic mistake for the Russians because, like I said, trying to hold a country as big as Ukraine is going to be very difficult, especially with a population that is very anti-Russia. And in many cases, instead of, breaking the will of the Ukrainians by them invading, they've galvanized the population against them. The question is of how much resistance they can continue to put out, which as of now has been tremendous. But the big question is going to be how long which side is going to throw in the towel first. And that's, I think, going to decide a lot of things. So, in summary, I just wanted to do this episode today because I felt it was important to go over what's happening, why, where, how, what, all these questions. There's still too much unknown and too little information coming out of Ukraine to develop a perfect picture of the situation, but this is what we know as of now. And as I've said repeatedly already, we're just in the beginning still, and this is something that's truly saddening on so many levels, and that because since World War II, while there have been conflicts and other things, the strategic scope and potential effects of this are exponential. While I pray to God we do not see a third world war anytime soon, this event has the potential of starting a third world war if wrong decisions are made on both sides. And that is absolutely, cataclysmic in its implications. So I think both the West, Russia, China, the major powers, they're, walking a tightrope right now on what can happen because no one expected Putin to do this. Many people thought he would, push the boundaries, do a lot. But by him doing this, he's rolled the dice, and it's going to be a mess in many cases. You know, I have some Ukrainian friends. My heart goes out to them, and also my heart goes out to both both Russians and Ukrainians who are in the midst of this, who don't want to be, and who are suffering because of the decisions of leaders. And I hope that the conflict will soon end and things can return to a state of normalcy. But I don't think there will ever be a new normal in terms of Russia-Ukraine relations after this, at least for the foreseeable future, because of the damage both politically, emotionally, psychologically, and culturally that has been done on the because of this. And the other question is, how far will it go, as previously said? So I do think that in terms of just the conflict and the human crisis, it's going to get worse. It's going to expand. The question is how much. But on the other side, we're already seeing the global implications on energy, fuel, the cost of things. We've already been in a pandemic for literally 2 years now, if not God, even longer now. But on top of that, add this into the fact: gas prices where I live in the United States have gone up tremendously just in the last few weeks. We haven't seen prices like this since 2008. So, and then the cost of food, because Ukraine is a huge supplier of grain and farming consumables. So there's been huge impacts on that. Not to mention energy. Russia provides a huge amount of natural gas and oil to Europe. That's going to be compromised, which it already has been. The United States has banned oil imports, and the UK is planned to do so by the end of the year. So I do think that you're going to see a huge shaking up of the world in terms of the cost of living, and the ability to live for everyone around the world is going to be, it's going to increasingly become more difficult because of the cost of things and the disruption to the global supply chain and the isolation of Russia given the sanctions. Because I can go on further on the sanctions that are happening, but Russia in many cases is becoming a isolated state, more like North Korea. Well, not at that level, with McDonald's pulling out, Starbucks, so many brands and companies moving out. Basically Russia is going to be further and further isolated by this, and that's only going to be more negative on them in the long term. And it's not going to be the politicians on either side, or on whoever side you're thinking about that suffer. It's going to be the everyday people. The Ukrainians are suffering, but the world is suffering in total because of the decisions that have led to this conflict, either directly or indirectly. And that's what's really saddening to me. So even though I live in the United States, I'm already thinking about what I can do to reduce the economic impact on myself and my family. And at the same time, what else can I do to help people around me understand this? By doing this episode is a great example. But, it's just truly saddening, and we have not seen the end of implications from this at all. There's going to be a lot more that's going to happen, a lot more debate, discussion, and I'm paying attention to the news, and specifically the decisions of many of the leaders involved in this, because I hope right decisions are made and the necessary steps are made to help those affected. And we need to try to prevent this from turning into a larger humanitarian crisis, and we need to try to find a way to stop this conflict as soon as we can. I don't think anything that NATO, the West, or European Union is doing now is going to stop the conflict, just because there's nothing they can do without getting involved in the war or entering into armed conflict with Russia that would stop it now. And the world does not want that, and I know the United States and many countries do not have the stomach or do not want to do that, because that's World War III, as previously mentioned. So again, I just wanted to do this today just to kind of put my thoughts out there and go over what's happening, why it's happening from what we know, the effects, implications, and my own personal thoughts of what's going to happen down the road. But it's truly a sad thing. I never thought I would, in this day and age, that I would live and witness something like this. I thought this was something that was resigned to history, but unfortunately we have been proved wrong. And I think we're entering a new world order, because something's been done that has not been done in such a long time. This is going to change a lot of dynamics from country to country. And specifically, I think that, you know, it's already seen to strengthen NATO, bring countries together. But, I think this next century, or the rest of this decade, is going to be very, for lack of a better term, interesting and convoluted because of this now. So that's just my 2 cents on this situation, and I'm working on more content to go over Ukraine, specifically to raise awareness and to try to understand it in more depth and more comprehensively by looking at all sides. One thing I think that is important that everyone does if you're going to try to watch and see what happens is please check out different news sources from different countries. Don't just focus on American news or British news or whatever. Look at every different news provider from different countries because you'll get a sense of their point of emphasis, bias, and other things, because it gives you a sense of what different countries and people and political will and social attitudes are toward this. And that's, I think, something that is important and something I've been doing while putting this together. Just kind of a quick thing because of just the fluid nature of the situation. So with that, I just wanted to put this together for, share my thoughts, opinions, and with what's happening right now. So my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine. I stand with them, and I stand with anyone who's resisting conflict and oppression. So my heart's hopes, and all go out to them, and I hope that they will be able to get to a point where they can continue their own manifest destiny, and they can return to a state of where they were before the war to, have the ability to live and pursue their lives as any human being should. With that, this has been another episode of International Immersion. We hope to see you on the next episode. Feel free to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, the same name. Just type in International Immersion. All three will come up. Like, subscribe, tell us your thoughts. You can also, if you want to collaborate or produce some joint content with us, send us an email at internationalimmersionpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to know what you think and what you have to say. And with that, we'll see you on the next one. Take care, and let's hope for a quick resolution.